All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the Wikilection live stream. Today's topic is news. For those of you joining the live stream for the first time, the goal of these live streams is to provide information about Wikilection, to improve the design of Wikilection itself, and then to refine the explanation. So the sort of words and the infographics used to show those off, to get them better, to refine them over time. For these live streams, we're cycling through some different topics to do with Wikilection to explain the different features. We're now down to 3. Today's topic is news, and then the other 2 are politics and science. And the idea is that every 2 weeks we'll cover one of those topics and then cycle through them so that every 6 weeks we've covered everything and then we loop back. As it says here, the idea is to present the topic in the current state. So today, of course, we'll be presenting news with the information currently available for it. The goal here is to get some feedback from either live audience or as people watch the recording to leave comments and ask what questions you have about the project or about certain features. And then in between now and the next time this topic is covered, we'd go through and refine the plans, possibly update some stuff, make some new infographics, that kind of thing. And then the next time we covered this topic, the goal is to have some new information so that it can be explained a little bit better each time. As the goal of Wikilection itself is to use evidence to fight misinformation. That's sort of the project overall. In the context of Wikilection, evidence refers to any information that can prove that something is true. And so some examples include some sort of a scientific report, things that a journalist might use, like eyewitness testimony or video interviews. And then there's things like court records and the data that some governments provide, like how money is spent, how certain politicians vote on legislation, that kind of thing. So on to today's topic, we're going to be talking about news. Let me quickly switch over to the comments. Okay, nothing there yet. So first we'll talk about the existing model of news. As it says here, the following slides show where evidence is used within the existing system and sort of how information flows from the evidence through the existing model to the public. This is, as you can probably tell, a fairly early stage infographic explaining the flow of information. We're going to start out from the outside and work our way in. So the outer area is the public, and the public needs to understand what's going on in the world. Often that's going to require understanding complex information or the evidence from a variety of disciplines, right? So science, economics, journalism, all of that kind of thing. Now, when we're talking about the public, technically everyone is a member of the public in some areas, and that includes experts. So as the example given here, an expert economist might still require a scientist to explain scientific information or, some theories or a paper, that kind of thing. So just because you're an expert in one thing doesn't mean you're an expert in everything. You see this commonly in the public eye when politicians rely on sort of news and other experts to relay information to them so that they can make their own decisions. Now, the way that the public interacts with this information, or I guess it's probably best to say it the other way around, the way that this information is presented to the public is through channels. And the channels, these produce content to provide important or interesting information to the public. Now, there's a lot going on out there. There's a ton going on in pretty much every area of the world and every topic. And so how does a channel decide what to talk about, or possibly more importantly, what not to talk about, right? What's not important enough to discuss and have a story about, and what is important enough. Now, examples of channels, there's your things like national TV news, right? So in the US, that might be like Fox News or CNN or MSNBC, that kind of thing. And then some other examples are your local radio station. And then social media is now a big source where you have things like YouTube channels, Twitter accounts, Facebook pages, that sort of thing. Anything that's sort of, either producing the content or technically even just sharing it. And they're the ones deciding of all the things that they could share, what are they going to share with their audience. Now, at this level, some of the challenges might include editorial bias. And so that's the actual sort of organization that's employing or working with people to create that content, to actually write the summary of what we're saying the evidence says. And there's some definite bias there of what ends up coming out, might sort of commonly be trying to tell the same kind of a story, to keep moving along the same narrative. And there's some definite room for bias there and skewing stories a certain way, which we'll talk about more. There's sensationalizing. And so that's maybe taking something that's not so important and making it seem, very, very important to talk about and vital and, end of the world type stuff when maybe the story doesn't warrant that. And finally, there's selective omission, where if it's something that maybe they don't want to talk about, they just don't write a story about it, even if it is important and even if other stations are covering it, but it doesn't fit within the narrative of that channel, they might omit talking about it altogether. Now, the next layer in are experts, and these are the people that the channels work with to explain this complex information or complex topics, to explain that to the public. And if somebody's being presented as an expert, we kind of assume they have some level of expertise. Sometimes it's just them claiming they do, and hopefully as we dissect that will sort of become apparent. Examples of experts, so they're going to be things like scientists and economists and people who are looking at sort of that, like the studies and the reports that you'll see mentioned in the news, where they'll bring on an expert to discuss that thing. There's people like politicians, where they're going to sort of have to talk about a wide variety of things. And if they're going to be talking about it, people listening are probably going to assume they have some level of expertise, or at least they've talked to an expert. And then you have people like journalists, where not only are they sort of talking to the other experts, but they're also assumed to be the expert in the area of journalism, deciding what's sort of a valid source and what's not, who's a good expert to talk to, who isn't, that kind of thing. At this level, your challenges include the bias of the experts, which is similar to the organizational bias, but this is just that one particular person. So even if, a news station hires a scientist, or at least they bring them on to discuss a topic, you're not only dealing with that organization's bias now, you're also dealing with the bias of that person. Now, similar to bias, there's conflicts of interest, where even if the person is maybe free of bias or as much as can be reasonably expected, people might still be skeptical if they have a conflict of interest in the thing that they're talking about, right? If they stand to make money off of it, if it's the family business, that kind of thing. And then you also have the case where you might bring somebody out that has an irrelevant skill set to what you're talking about, right? Just because somebody is a scientist doesn't mean that they're an expert in all areas of science. If we're talking, about astrophysics, maybe bringing on a biologist isn't going to be terribly useful, or as useful as bringing on somebody who's specialized in that area. Now, the next layer is the evidence itself. And so this is the kind of information that experts use to determine if something is true, right? And this is going to usually involve some kind of expertise or training in order to verify that the information is, accurate and trustworthy, and that you're referencing it correctly. Now, examples of evidence, there's scientific reports, there's the legislation and laws that are created or proposed, there's things like court recordings or other sort of data that's available to the public, either, from the government itself or from some of its branches, and then things like video recordings, images, that type of thing. Now, the challenges at this level include verifying that the evidence itself is, good and accurate and worth using, right? So that might be in a scientific report, was the study sort of designed properly? Did the outcomes of it make sense? Do the learnings of it, are they appropriate for what happened? That kind of thing. Now, even if you have a really good, high quality, verified piece of evidence, the other challenge that comes next is if it's being accurately referenced. So you can have, a world-class scientist talking about their specialty, and the paper that they produce might be absolutely perfect, but then if someone talking about it inaccurately references it, well, that you still can't trust what's being said, because even though the paper's trustworthy, the statement about it might not be. And then another challenge with evidence is if you're cherry picking examples. So if there's 10 pieces of evidence talking about the same thing, and 9 pieces of evidence agree one way, and there's one, outlier piece of evidence, and that's the one you choose to focus on, and maybe don't even mention that, hey, 90% of the evidence available on this topic points the other direction. You're only talking about that one. That's kind of a dishonest way of presenting information, and it's commonly how people will get away with, making something seem controversial and up to debate when in fact it might not be up to debate. Now this next slide, this is actually sort of 2 new infographics I'm trying out. So this is the first time I'm talking about them. There is some overlap with the previous slides, but hopefully it makes it a bit more clear. So in this slide, we're trying to talk about what the outcome of that previous model is, sort of where that leaves us. So we talked about organizational bias, and some channels are heavily biased and tell a deceptively single-sided story. And we sort of talked about what some of those methods are. That might be sensationalizing. That might be, just not talking about something that doesn't fit with their narrative, or presenting extreme or fringe positions as mainstream. Like if you find one person in the opposing group that believes a certain thing and present it as, well, maybe they all believe this, without any actual research into how common is this belief. So there's 2 sort of different playbooks here, that depending on if the coverage, could be considered positive or negative, and if it's about the organization or their allies, or if it's about the rivals of the organization. So if something is a positive story about them or their allies, or it's a negative story about their rivals, you'll see one playbook where, of course, they want to publicize it. They want to make sure that people know that either they and their allies did something good, or their rivals did something bad, or something bad happened to them, that sort of thing. In both cases, they're probably going to want to sensationalize it, right? If it's something that their side did, it's the best in the world, we just saved everyone, it's great. If it's something that their rivals did bad, this is the end of the world, we're all going to die, that sort of, over the top sensationalizing of a story. And of course, they're going to want to make sure that the public knows who is responsible. So if it's something good, they're going to make sure that they, give themselves and their allies all the credit they possibly can. And if it's something bad, they're going to make sure that they heap all the responsibility onto their rivals. A common example there is you'll see, with different political parties arguing about things, you'll have, if something good happens at the start of one government's term, they're going to claim credit for it because it happened during their term. And their rivals that just maybe went out of office said, well, no, that's our policies now coming into effect. That's actually because of us. Now, the other playbook are where it's things that maybe they don't want to talk about, or it doesn't fit with their narrative. So that can be things like when there's a negative story about themselves or their allies, or there's a positive story about their rivals. And so usually the first thing they try to do is just not mention it. Right? We just, again, that's the selective omission. That's saying, well, we just won't talk about that thing at all because it doesn't fit into the narrative and there's no real way to spin it into what story we're trying to tell. The other thing is to minimize importance, which is kind of the opposite of sensationalizing. It's saying, well, yeah, this happened, but it's not very important because of these reasons. And you can see how that might fit in if we're talking about something negative about themselves. Don't worry, it's not a big deal. Or something good that their rivals did. Yeah, maybe they did it, but who cares? It's not that important. And then finally, you might discredit parts of the story involved. So you might say, like, if it's something negative about their allies, you might try to discredit the people involved, the sources of information, the people telling the story, that kind of thing. And the same thing if there's a positive story about your rivals, trying to say, again, how can we trust what they're saying, that sort of thing. Now, when we're talking narrative, you can see this image in the bottom left is sort of trying to show what that might look like. So like groups, or I guess you could say groups A and B, those could be political parties, those could be, news channels, that type of thing. And then these sort of, I guess, it's kind of meant to be a light here, is meant to show how many people they're reaching with their content. So you can see, A and B, they're reaching about the same amount of people. And then there's a fair amount where there's no overlap, right? So part of having a one-sided narrative is that if you're saying, everything good about us is, true and needs to be told, and everything bad about our rivals is, also true and needs to be told, but everything else is pushed to the side, it starts to imply an obvious truth in that area, right? So if we're saying we're great and we're the best and our rivals are terrible people that are dumb and evil, you start to sort of be able to paint that picture with this model of talking about what's going on in the world. And when you're implying an obvious truth, that also allows you to paint the opposing side as either evil or stupid, right? Either they're too dumb to see what's going on and see this, and they don't have access to the same information we do, so they're making bad decisions, or they understand exactly what's going on and there's some sort of malice, or they're evil and trying to destroy something. Now, in this image in the bottom left, you can see, right, you've got, there you go. You can see group A, right? You can see this blue part here is showing all the people that are being exposed to their content. And this top group here, where all they're seeing is information from A, they're going to believe A in most cases, right? Unless there's some trust issue. If it's, well presented and they're watching it, there's probably some amount of trust there. So they'll be at least a lot more likely to believe group A, right? Now at the bottom, you can see that there's a group that's only being exposed to the content from group B. And so they're going to believe what group B has to say, right? And so in a lot of cases, if they're being presented with that one-sided narrative, these groups are kind of going to think of each other as, again, either stupid or evil with how information is presented if it's that really single-sided narrative. Now, part of the challenge for these news agencies comes from the people that are being exposed to both, right? So they're seeing this conflicting information, and if they see that there's a notable difference between the stories being told from the different channels or from the different sides, well, it becomes obvious that at least one of them is lying, right? Or they're telling half-truths, or so maybe both of them are. But when two of them are telling very concrete, there's not a lot of wiggle room, you can tell at that point that, again, at least one of them is lying, because if one of them is telling the truth, then the other one has to be completely wrong, because there's usually not a lot of room for error when comparing those two sides. Now, where can we go from this kind of a system? We're now going to talk about the proposed solution, something that Wikilection might be able to help with. Now, to talk about this, we'll actually talk about it in the opposite order. So we'll start off with the evidence. Now, when we're looking at evidence within Wikilection, the goal here is that the community reviews it. So it's not this hidden panel of experts in a back room. The community itself, and especially people who are experts in that area within the community, they'll review that evidence for any issues. And the kind of review that they would do is going to be based on the kind of evidence, right? So a scientific report is going to require different review than something like legislation or maybe a journalist's sources. Another important thing to keep in mind for evidence is who created it. And so by tracking the people and the organizations involved in creating the evidence, you can ensure that qualified people were involved in the creation of it, and you can spot hopefully any conflicts of interest, right? If that group stands to make a lot of money, if things are proven one way or the other, maybe you take that with a grain of salt, especially if they're the only ones talking about it or the only ones that reach that conclusion. And then as we hinted at earlier, it's also being able to sort of group evidence that's talking about the same thing and that in theory should be coming up with the same result, even if they don't. Because right, if they're talking about the same topic and it's cut and dry, all the evidence should point in the same way. And so when you're able to group together similar evidence, you can sort of say, hey, this piece of evidence is, like in the previous example, if there's 10 pieces and one of them leans one way and the other 9 lean the other way, if you're being shown that one piece of information that leans one way, we can then say, hey, just so you know, 90% of the evidence on this topic actually disagrees with the outcome of this one, so keep that in mind. Now, again, just like on the other side with the sort of typical media approach, a lot of the evidence still needs expert review. We still need to make sure that people who really know that industry and know that topic are the ones that really sort of have the most input, or at least have a larger say in the conversation. And a part of how we help with that is setting up expert profiles. So this is where we track either the expert or the people claiming to be experts. And we track the people who are involved in providing that information on complex topics, right? So as experts are introduced in different news stories, you start to create a profile and saying, oh, hey, this expert, that CNN or Fox News or MSNBC or whoever, they brought out this expert to talk about this topic. So we track that expert. And then we start to track the things that they're saying, right? The claims that they're making on topics. And like it says here, this includes any people, for example, journalists or organizations involved in telling the story, along with the experts they bring in to consult, right? So if you're thinking about like a TV news show, there's their actual sort of regular hosts and staff that are on TV, sort of generally talking about the same kind of narrative. And then the experts that you might only see once, or it might be somebody who, is a repeat guest. The goal is to sort of track this information for all of them. And part of the information that we would track for these people are going to be things like, their education, their career history, what sort of expertise do they have in this topic, and then also things like their financial ties, right? Possible conflicts of interest, stuff where even if you're very experienced and, you're definitely smart enough to be talking about the topic at hand, if you're neck deep in conflicts of interest, that still might, mean people should take what you're saying with a grain of salt. And then, as it says here at the bottom with this note, this group of experts is also including politicians who will have additional history related to their activities while campaigning or in office, right? So they'll have that level of what they've said as an expert, what they've claimed on different topics, while also having the extra layer of information as a politician, like how they voted while in office, things that a non-politician might not have. Now, the other part to experts is to review the expert claims, right? So we talked about that we review the expert for sort of how valid or how well designed or how trustworthy the piece of evidence is. Then when somebody is trying to make, I guess you could say, a claim against that evidence or towards that evidence, saying, hey, based on this study, we can learn X. If somebody's making a claim like that, you want to, of course, track the claim itself, and you want to track the expert that made that claim. And then the community and other experts can review that claim for accuracy. And so you can start to see how accurate the claims for each person are and for each topic, right? So if 10 people are chiming in on a certain topic, you can start to figure out who's qualified, who maybe has some conflicts of interest, that type of thing. Right, and then also all the claims that a certain person has made, you can start to see the timeline of, oh, okay, they're actually quite good in this area. Oh, this area, maybe even though they probably know it, they're shown to be maybe not that accurate, possibly because they have some bias or a conflict of interest. Now as well, when you have that kind of information, you can start to see like the industry average of what the industry thinks about that thing. So when we're looking at, what 10 experts think about a certain piece of information or about certain claims, you can start to say, hey, if we have 10 experts that all chimed in on this, and 9 of them lean one way, and somebody brings out that, that one expert that disagrees with the other ones, is to make sure people know that, but then also, are they, a world-class expert and the other 9 are sort of not that good? So maybe you actually should listen. Or is this person, maybe they have some irrelevant experience, right? Like it's an issue to do with, if we use the current example, right? Like people talking about viruses and things being contagious. And if you bring out like a physicist or a chemist instead of somebody that's specialized in that area, it's not to say they wouldn't have any insight, but if you have somebody that's truly a world expert in that area, their weight probably carries a bit more. And then finally, the version of channels for Wikilection, what that might look like is, first of all, we would want to review the existing content. So the content put out by the actual channels themselves, the community can review that for accuracy in reporting, right? So when all the claims that make up a story that you might see in the news, there's generally going to be expert cited, and they'll generally be making claims about certain evidence and about certain things that they found out in studies. And so on the actual news that we're seeing about this, is to track those claims, the same information that we've been talking about so far, and then you can start to track the individual stories and group the stories that are about the same event or about that same thing, and then you can start to categorize it to show people information that they care about, which is the next thing here. It allows you to filter by interest. So when the community reviews a bunch of the evidence, and the experts will then review that evidence, and then the community reviews the content that comes out of that, part of what they're also doing is figuring out what category that belongs into, right? Like, is this environmental? Is this business? Whatever sort of categories the community wants to use to group this information. And you end up with this enormous pool of possible things that you could care about, right? Sort of things going on in the world, all the stories being grouped together into the individual events. You're going to end up with a bunch of those. Sort of like how we said that one of the jobs of a channel is to figure out what to filter out and what to talk about. The idea here is that people can do that themselves based on indicating what topics they're interested in. And then aside from that, it's the community that says, oh, this certain story is about this topic, right? So let's say it's about environmentalism and business. Maybe it covers both. So people interested in those topics should probably see the story. If they're not interested in either of those topics, maybe they don't. But it's not Wikilection deciding what's important and what's not. It's the community deciding sort of what category it belongs in and how important the story is within that category. And then if you've said that you're interested in those things, you're going to be more likely to see that story. And then aside from just tracking the events themselves and the individual pieces of content, because you've now got a certain event happening, you might have 5 stories that were written about it, and you can see what those 5 stories are, sort of how accurate they are, how well they tell the story, maybe where they disagree with other stories. You can also track the channel responsible for that content and start to learn what kinds of content the channel is producing, how accurate it is, maybe what categories it's really good at talking about, maybe the categories it's not so good at talking about. So that's sort of a really high level idea of how this part on the right, the Wikilection view, is an alternative to the part on the left, where it's the channel deciding what story gets told and working with experts to figure out what proof to sort of work with to be able to tell the story. But there's a lot of room there for either the experts or the channels to decide how to tell that story. And in this case, the community sort of is trying to do that less so with words and more with review and data, so that each person can decide what they want to read on, and it's not a channel doing it for them. Now, some of the features that will support the news area in Wikilection, we'll go over these. Now, these features are covered in some of the other topics, but I think it'll help give some context as to why why we're talking about the news feature and something that's trying to solve misinformation. To be honest, the news feature wasn't on the initial board of sort of things that Wikilection was trying to do. And this topic is actually replacing the core features topic from the previous sort of attempts at doing this. Because as I was creating the content for it, I realized that it's largely the same thing. So we'll talk about why that is. So first, if you've watched the slide on politics, where we talk about tracking important events for individuals, like for politicians, you may have seen this slide. So here we're talking about important events, and the idea here on sort of a individual politician basis in this screenshot is that we're tracking the individual events, and we group similar articles or similar pieces of content about that event underneath it, right? So in the example here, you're seeing that this is for Stephen Connor, who's the incumbent mayor for a city called Fake Town. And we're looking at one of the important events called abuse of power. And there's the summary here, some of the stuff, people voting on what category that belongs to and how important it is. But underneath, you can see that there is, oh, I grabbed the wrong thing, 1 second. Oh, it's actually not an arrow that I can move. Never mind. So you can see underneath, there is 3 articles that are grouped underneath that abuse of power event. And of course, if that was sort of a larger event that maybe happened at like this, state or provincial or federal level, you probably end up with a lot more articles on that topic. But in this case, to keep it simple, it was sort of a local city example. And so there's 3 stories that were written, let's like over the course of about 2 months that were about that topic, right? So it's showing here that like there's some information available, and then you can see, kind of hard to see in this screenshot, but it's actually saying that that one is only suspected. So maybe the evidence available for that one isn't concrete, but if you actually read through it, the community definitely thinks like, yeah, that probably happened, we just can't prove it. But it's only showing up as suspected because it's important to note that, hey, this hasn't been totally confirmed. But this feature gives the ability to group those individual articles into sort of one event that now are tracking that event, and we can track who was involved in that event, and like who is possibly the person who did that thing, who came out to talk about it, who reported on it, who was possibly even like a judge that tried a case. Anybody that's involved with it, we want to know what they were involved with. And then we can track here if that event actually happened and what information is available to prove or disprove it. Oh, I see a question here from Ernesto. Quick review of the whole process that you are proposing. So one second, let me click this to show the question here. So can I give a quick review of the whole process that I am proposing? This part is sort of trying to give an overview of the process from the news angle. So from the thing of, if you're trying to figure it out, how do you, I guess, how do you know that you can trust a certain information source over another? And what does that look like if you're trying to fight misinformation in news? To cover the whole thing would probably take like a couple hours to go through all the available content in every nook and cranny. So we're trying to do it from the 3 sort of angles of news, which is today's topic, politics, and science, being the 3 ways to talk about it. If there are specific questions you have, but by all means, please type them out, and I'll see if I can cover them with the content available. And if not, I might try to create a new sort of infographic or a new slide in between now and the next topic to help answer whatever questions I can't answer now. But I guess the short answer is this is meant to be a quick-ish review of specifically the news angle of Wikilection. I hope that makes sense. So we're talking about the news elements, sort of the individual pieces of Wikilection that help support the ability to have this kind of a news aggregate tool. We talked about the ability to group articles under a certain event. Now, if we look at the next screenshot here for Stephen, you can see this is still an important event that's being tracked, but in this case, it's showing as confirmed, which again is a bit hard to see. And you can tell in the bottom right here on the image, there's 3 different occurrences. What happened in 2007, 2010, and 2012. And then you can also see above where it says excessive expenses, like the actual box in the middle. There's a little line coming out with 3 lines showing the instances that has happened on their timeline. So you can see that these excessive expenses happened 3 times while they were a council member. And then underneath it, again, you can see the news that supports it. And here, this is trying to show that if there's multiple occurrences of the same thing, one of the things that we might want to do, unless they're important enough or different enough to keep separate, but it may be useful to sort of group them and summarize them so that you can say, hey, if this person had 12 instances of it having excessive expenses, we don't want their timeline dominated by it. So we just want to say, hey, but by the way, this person has a history of having excessive expenses. Here's the instances of that. And then you can see here, or it might be hard to see actually, but that's sort of giving a negative score to their category for finances, which we talk about a bit in the topic on politics. We have another question here. Have you considered a parameter for news and events that could be called, I guess I'll actually click to show it. It could be called ratio of effect for discerning when the effects of an event have local, regional, national, or international implications. That sounds like something that when the community is reviewing it and they're sort of categorizing it, there's some top level categorizations like, is this about the environment? Is this about business? Is this about religious freedoms? Whatever those topics are. But there will be some level of people being able to sort of create their own categories. So like if we're talking about something at the level, like if it's something that, a city councilor did, you'll still want the same categorization of, is this business, is this environmental, is this, about ethics, that kind of thing. But there will also need to be some level of what region does this pertain to? Is this just, you only care about this if you're in a certain county? Is it sort of a statewide, like, hey, this was, maybe a good governor doing something, so that's where it matters. Or as you said, it might be national or international. So there is a parameter for it. It's hard to sort of show it now, but I think at the basic level, for an event, you will be able to show what sort of scope or what area that event is more likely to be important to people in. I hope that makes sense and answers your question. We're talking about the multiple events happening with the same thing and sort of grouping them together so that if someone does the same thing again and again and again, it doesn't dominate their timeline. And that can be positive or negative. One important thing here is that important events, which the example on the left called fundraising record is meant to show, it's not just trying to be negative, which a lot of these examples are, because that sort of is what people tend to be more interested in, which is part of the reason why the news tends to sensationalize. But we also want to make sure that we're tracking the good things that people are doing, because we don't just want this to be a list of all the ways that politicians are terrible, because then who do we vote for? We still need governments with how things are currently set up in the world. So it is important just to know who's good, who's bad, maybe who's in the middle, and more realistically, who's good and bad about certain topics, because it's not always so cut and dry to just say that this person is good and that person is bad, right? You'll want to do topics sort of like we're talking about with these examples, right? We're like, are they good with finances? Are they, known for being ethical? Do they give to charity? All those kinds of things that you might want to know about a person. Oh, I should probably hide the comment there. So that was talking about the news elements. And then finally, we're going to borrow a bit from the conversation on the scientific sort of having the conversation around controversial science topics. And the same thing that we showed there, where you're reviewing content and sort of highlighting it and trying to get an idea for A, is the evidence accurate? And then B, is it being used correctly? That same system is going to be used here for tracking news, right? So this image was sort of stolen from that section of this document and changed a little bit, because now we aren't talking about sort of certain claims or stances or sides of an argument, but instead how this might look on an article, right? So if we look at in the top left, actually 1 second, I'm going to go borrow an arrow from somewhere that I can move around, because that will make this easier with how this software works. There we go. So if we're looking at this top row here for articles, there's two shown. There's the one in green and the one in orange. And the color is sort of meant to show how trustworthy that thing is. So if we start at the bottom, we can see there's 5 pieces of evidence sort of being discussed or maybe on this topic. And the color here is meant to be how sort of good is that article. And in this case, to keep the image sort of easier to understand, it's a combination of how good the article is and how well it's being referenced. So the letters underneath are meant to be sort of which claim that thing supports. So you can see Article 1, well, that would support claims A, B, C, and D. And Article 2 supports, claims A, F, H, and M, and so on. So you can see here that claim A is in sort of a darker green because there's 3 articles that support it. There's Article 1, there's Article 2, and Article 5. Now, Article 5 is showing in gray because maybe it's not the best one, right? It hasn't been sort of judged as good or bad, but we just aren't sure if that article is good yet. So it's sort of, we'll hold off. But it is supported by Articles 1 and 2, which have been shown to be pretty good. So right now, that one's fairly well sourced and shows in a darker green. Claim C has 2 pieces of supporting information. Article 1, which is the same thing that Claim A uses, and Article 5, which again is gray and not, we aren't sure if it's useful or trustworthy yet. So Claim C is still showing it as green because it has some supporting information that's been verified, but it's not as well verified as Claim A, so it's not quite as green. And then finally, you have Claim E, which is a claim that's being made by the other article on the topic where it's only got one claim that's showing in orange because maybe it's not so good. And you can see here that it's referencing article 3 that's showing in orange. So that is an article that's been reviewed and been shown. Maybe it's not that good. Maybe, there's some issues with either the article itself or just how it's being referenced in claim E. So that one, it's not actually that useful of a piece of evidence to cite. And the only other thing that they're citing is article 5, which, as we know from the previous examples, is showing in gray because we aren't sure. So claim A has 2 good and 1 sort of neutral. Claim C has 1 good and 1 neutral. And claim E has 1 bad and 1 neutral. So that's sort of trying to show how you might be able to boil up at the top here. We're saying that the green article is good because it's got 2 fairly, defendable claims. And then the orange one isn't because it's making 1 claim that, doesn't really seem to be based on good information from what we know about it. So to combine this, you can start to see how the ability to sort of track those events, and then that will allow us to sort of group the individual topics together. Like these 2 articles might be talking about the same event, but they're sort of showing 2 very different outcomes or 2 very different things that we might be able to learn from that event. And then if we're trying to figure out which article is more trustworthy, this is where this sort of flow comes in, where it's looking at the claims made, it's looking at how those claims compare to the evidence available and how good that evidence is. And then the goal here is for all to boil up to the top, so you can just tell at a glance which article is trustworthy and which one isn't. So that is it for the news topic. The next topic that we'll be covering is, I believe, politics. And so that, of course, we'll go over politicians and elections, and I'll go over some of the same stuff like with the important events, but in a bit more detail and talking specifically about the kinds of information that will be available for politicians and elections and political parties and so on. Now I will want to give Ernesto kind of a minute to see if he has any final questions before I sign off. But if you don't, thank you for watching and participating, Ernesto. That was helpful, and I hope that I was able to somewhat answer your questions. Okay, unfortunately I can't, it doesn't show if somebody is typing or not. So I don't think, oh, there you go, give the thumbs up, so we're good. All right, so I guess we will end it here. Next week on Saturday, I'll be posting the link and sort of the, I guess the scheduled link onto, again, Facebook, and sort of scheduling it on YouTube, just like I did this week. And the idea is that the alternating weeks will go actually having a session, posting it and scheduling it and sort of starting the conversation, and then the following week doing it, and then that sort of alternating, posting it, doing it, posting it, doing it, if that makes sense. If you do have any questions, please feel free to either leave a comment on wherever you're watching this, or you can also find more information about Wikilection on the website, which is www.wikilection.com. And as well, Facebook is a fairly good place to find information now, which is just facebook.com/Wikilection. And we do have a Patreon, but it's not all that active yet because we've only got 2 people. So that isn't a big focus now, but as that grows, we might end up moving some content there. So I will end it here. Thank you again, everyone watching, and thanks again to Ernesto for participating. I will see you all in 2 weeks. Thanks. Bye.